It was early morning on Saturday, 10 December 1932, when a forest green dress was spotted, hooked in a spiky thicket of lantana in Queen's Park. Nearby was a naked woman, lying face down on a bed of overgrown brambles and weeds beneath a coral tree. When local teenager Bernard Green saw the body, he did not, at first, believe his eyes. The air was still cool, and an unseasonal dreamlike mist hung in the valleys of the residential suburb of Waverley as he walked south, away from Bondi and towards Randwick. He'd taken this journey countless times before, and he was very familiar with the shortcuts through back lanes, vacant lots and public parks. Coming down a steep hill towards Randwick, he always cut through the grove of coral trees in Queen's Park, because it was a little quicker and usually a little more pleasant than walking along the road. The teenager didn't see the body up close, and from a distance, the skin seemed to glow eerily in the early morning light. When he realised with horror what he was looking at, he stopped dead in his tracks. He ran from the scene, heading towards the nearest household he knew had a telephone.
Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast, sponsored by Pantera Press. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Hello and welcome back to the Good Reading Podcast. I'm Max Lewis, and today we're joined by author Dr. Tanya Bretherton, a sociologist with a special interest in narrative life history and social history. Her latest book, The Killing Streets, uncovers Australia's first serial murders at a time where the term serial killer did not exist. Brutal murders, victims that are less than perfect, cops determined to get their man no matter the cost, sensationalist newspapers, and finally, a dubious suspect who may or may not be the killer. It all adds up to a case that is as maddening as it is fascinating. Tanya, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Now, as a true crime fan myself, particularly that of Australian crimes, I was quite fascinated by considering how large and sensational this case was that I'd never heard about it before. How did you first come across it?
I came across it while I was researching another book, and it kind of stayed with me. It was a newspaper article that I came across, and it was about Eric Craig, which much of the book is about. And I kind of sat on it for a while. It was one of those projects where I picked it up for a while and then I would set it down. And then we had another couple of quite high-profile, very recent, horrible cases.
Yes.
In Melbourne, Jill Maher and Eurydice Dixon, and it made me return to it with fresh eyes.
Yeah.
From that point on, I approached it as I do all of my projects, with a view to writing something more substantial about it. And when I got into it, I was amazed at the twists and turns that this story has.
Absolutely, and the parallels with what's happening today as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a strange case, as horrifying as all of the cases in the book are, because over the course of about 25 years, the book looks briefly and more deeply at about 10 of these horrible sort of lust murders, I guess. So whatever language you want to use when you're talking about these horrible things. As horrifying as it is to say, it's like every age has been defined by one of these crimes. When I was growing up in Brisbane, one occurred, and it was sort of burned into the consciousness of all the teenagers in Brisbane at the time. So, I'm very aware that it's a horrible thing that just seems to stay with us.
Absolutely. And in the research, it seems like there's so much more research than your previous two books. There's court transcripts and newspaper excerpts and everything. How different was this process of research for you?
It was, the volume with this was enormous.
Absolutely.
Much more than the other two. I think because the other two books could hone very narrowly in on a specific family, this became much bigger.
Well, I didn't want to spoil too much of the book in this podcast because, as you said, the twists and turns in this case have to be read to be believed. But I did want to get a bit of backstory and context on the landscape that the book takes place against. And one of those is that it takes place during the Great Depression. And a lot of people might have seen scenes of the Great Depression in books, films and TV, or they might have spoken to their relatives about it. But I guess it's harder to gauge how it was exactly in Australia. So I was wondering if you could give some of that context of what the Great Depression was like in Sydney.
Yeah, look, I'm fascinated by that as well. And one of the reasons why I think Eric Craig as a character was such an interesting figure to zoom in on is because he really was experiencing the Great Depression.
Absolutely.
He had been out of work for several years. He queued at the docks to get the dole down at the wharves every week, or otherwise would have been without an income, and he was trying to look after 2 children in an era where a lot of women didn't work, and so having a male breadwinner really was very, very important. There was no real social welfare system in the sense of the way that we think about it.
Yeah.
So without work, you were really, really vulnerable. So Eric Craig, in part, was living off his mother as well. It's hard, I think, for us to imagine the risk that people faced when they didn't have work. So on one side, there was Eric Craig's story as a family man trying to manage the responsibilities associated with that. But there was also the depression being experienced and felt through the victims. So the 3 women that I guess kind of covers sort of the first half of the book, and I guess it was the compressed way that those murders occurred within kind of a 6, 7, 8 month period, I guess, within 1932. They were all working as prostitutes, and it was very clear that it was out of desperation because it was one of the more recession-proof occupations that you could participate in. So it was a way to get money when other options were not available to those women, because jobs were being given to men.
Given the whole breadwinning society that Australia was built off during this time, it would have been quite emasculating for a man, for a head of the family, to not be able to sustain that image. So would the social pressure of the Depression potentially have caused a lot more, I guess, violence and aggression in men at the time?
Yeah, I'd never actually thought about it that way, but that is a really interesting way of seeing it. And it possibly explains some of the other cases that I won't obviously go into too much, because I always tend to overshare when I talk about the books, but I think that is also an interpretation that could be read into some of the other cases.
I'm wondering if that's why perhaps in a particular case that I'm thinking of, which I won't mention, but you'll probably understand, where the perpetrator was given quite a lenient sentence given the severity of the crime.
Yeah.
Although I think that took place in the 40s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So, but it was still, post-war,
Yes.
I guess, like people taking a softer look at men because of what they went through in the war or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what you mentioned about sex workers as well leads me into my next question, which was the attitude towards sex workers at the time, which the book deals with a lot because police and the media and society at large didn't have a very favourable opinion on sex workers at the time. What exactly was the state of sex work during the Great Depression? Because I know it wasn't decriminalised until about 95, if I'm not mistaken, so it was illegal. Yeah,
absolutely. I write history as a sociologist, if that makes sense. So I guess the interpretation that I brought to the events was linked very much to the car, and I go into that a little bit more.
That was a really fascinating part of the book.
Look, other historians might view those events differently, but in terms of these cases and the level of risk that the women were taking in order to engage in sex work, the car was intimately involved with that because it provided physically a vehicle, but also it was a place of business, and part of that, on my reading of the events, was tied to the level of pressure that the police had placed on the close focus around Surrey Hills, and those stories in Sydney are very famous.
Yeah, absolutely.
Around the brothels in that time, because we had some very famous madams running those brothels. But I think one of the consequences of that pressure of trying to kind of clean out the streets and get women off the streets and make sex work less visible, part of the consequence was that it was sort of pushed into a different business model.
Yeah.
And I think these cases are tied to that because women took risks, and it became a very, very invisible thing, if that makes sense. And I think, I'm not giving up too much away, but the women were all left in very public places, but it was very clear. In some cases they'd walked there, but in most cases they'd sort of been driven there.
And speaking of the parallels, as we did before, it was quite interesting to see that the reputation of sex workers between then and now, how they're treated in the media and by people, hasn't really changed that much, even since being decriminalised.
Yeah.
Especially when sex workers are unfortunately killed in their line of work.
Yeah,
it seems like they get so much less focus, or they get so much more negative focus than do other women who are murdered.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, one of the things that I struggled with a little bit was the language around how we talk about these things. And in the end, because sex work really, that is a label that we would use now.
The politically correct term.
It wasn't a label that was used then. It did not exist. And in the book, the women in these occupations are described as prostitutes, and the State Library uses that term. It was the term that was used, and I thought, as conflicted as we feel about that term, it's an important thing to put in the book.
It's an important part of history to recognise.
Yeah. It just didn't feel right to talk about them as sex workers because they weren't referred to in that way.
And dialing back on the police as well, I was wondering what the state of the police force was like at the time. As you say in the book, it's a time before serial killers were really known. I don't think that was until the 60s or 70s.
Yeah.
And forensics weren't really nearly as much of a thing. So it seemed like the police were quite ill-equipped to deal with the magnitude of the case.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I think they were really corrupt as well.
Yeah.
I mean, they were horribly corrupt. It's police historians may have a different view on that and probably know a lot more about it than I do. But, you're absolutely right. And that was certainly the interpretation that I brought to this material. Yes, they took blood samples. They clipped nail pairings and those sorts of things from the victims when they were found. There wasn't a lot they could do with it. They could determine that it was human blood, maybe a blood tape.
Yeah.
Other than that, fingerprints they could take, and in fact they became kind of ingenious about how they got fingerprints or lifted fingerprints off victims. There's one case I talk about in the book where a victim had been left in water and they basically peeled the skin off the victim's hand like a glove in order to get an image of what the fingerprint looked like. But then they really couldn't do a lot other than basic identification. So there's no DNA, there's none of that stuff that we kind of use now to link a suspect to a particular crime or crime scene. So in the absence of all that, what we had was them trying to drum up a whole lot of witnesses and run around madly doing probably, what was one of the biggest, door-to-door.
You mentioned that. It was something like a 1,000 or over 1,000 doors in one day.
Yeah, that's right. So I think out of desperation because with 3 murders occurring in such a short space of time, the pressure was on. So they had to find someone, and so they did.
The police did quite mishandle the case. Do you think that was because of the lack of technology and means available to them, or was there something more, I guess, sinister or organised at play?
It's hard. I struggled a little bit with how to write that as well, because there is no doubt they had a level of challenge that's difficult for us to comprehend today. It would have been really hard police work. I also think they were corrupt. Yeah. I mean, I even the way that they engaged in the interrogation. Now, we know that people can be bullied into giving confessions. I think they knew that too.
They had to know.
Yeah, they had to know. So I think it's a bit of both in answer to your question, probably.
And my final part of getting some context around the landscape of the book is to deal with the media as well, because the media plays a huge role in how the case unfolds and how it's perceived by the public, creating public panic, shaming the police, and even influencing witnesses and the trial that ultimately occurred. It's almost quite unbelievable how outlandish the media acts during this time. Could you give a bit of a context on the state of journalism and print media in this time, and I guess how they were able to get away with what they did?
Well, the one thing that I have found fascinating, and it's come up in the other 2 books that I've written as well, is how closely connected the media were to the police.
Yeah.
So they used each other in the firm belief that it was in the best interest to get as much information out as possible, to make the police appear that they were always in a good light. That kind of went a bit sour with this case because it became very obvious that not enough was happening. So, I think that's probably one of the things I've learnt over the course of all three books. There was a deep connection. There was a lack of awareness, I think, that if you keep printing photographs of the victim
and doctoring them,
and doctoring them, and at the same time trying to drum up witness statements and using that photograph, which is what the police did. They would keep going back using a photograph combined with lineups, and they would keep repeating that process until they got the answer that they wanted, because they very definitely wanted to nail Craig for it. And I don't think I'm giving too much away to talk about that. And of course, I'm not involved in the police and I'm not involved in the media, but just in seeing the more careful way that the police manage the media these days in terms of controlling the amount of information that they release so that it doesn't then tarnish an investigation later on. There was little regard given for that back then.
And the legal system as well finally plays a huge role, at least halfway through the book, with the trials of Eric Craig. What was the legal system like back then in terms of how they, could go about prosecuting criminals?
Craig was prosecuted. He faced many trials, let's put it that way. So he was tried over and over again for the one crime.
Yeah, which today seems impossible.
Yeah, it's just extraordinary. But it was also an environment where getting good legal representation was difficult. They weren't a wealthy family. From my memory, and it's been a couple of years since I've actually written the book, but the legislation supporting, effectively court-appointed, I don't know that we use that language, but public purse-supported representation, that was only a very recent thing. Craig had very little control over the defence that was presented on his behalf. And even in terms of the documentation, no one says it, but within there's one case where a lawyer refers to, well, look, I'm basically standing up in court and I'm representing this man for his life because you face the death penalty if you were convicted of murder. The stakes were high, and the lawyer makes reference to, well, I got these papers last night. Yes, very different.
Aside from the brutality of the crimes, there's a lot in the book that's quite maddening as to the police procedure and the way that the victims are treated, all of that. What else surprised or shocked you while you were on your fact-finding mission for the book? Probably
the fact that even in the context of it being a very judgmental society, so little was done, particularly with some of those earlier cases. So there's a lot of focus in the book over the cases that happened in 1932, but many of the women that died over the course of that 25 years were engaged in sex work, and it was very, very clear that no one really gave a damn. Yeah. And that shouldn't have shocked me, and it still did.
Well, yeah, given how our society treats sex workers now, it shouldn't be surprising.
It shouldn't be surprising because we know how abhorrent and the level of judgment around those activities then in the 20s, because it deals with the 20s as well. But I was still really shocked that as a society we could have let that happen.
Well, the book has a really great quote where it compares the worker working on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, how he risked his life every day to feed his family, and the sex worker trying to feed her family doesn't receive the same regard.
Yeah, okay, there we go. It really did shock me, because there was so much that, if you look at news of that time, it was saturated with stories about the bridge. It opened that year. Yeah. And in all of the decade leading up to that, it was all anyone talked about. The lead up to building it, then the process of building it. You're absolutely right. And there's very heroic stories about the workers and the level of risk that they were forced to undertake, and that some men lost their lives during that process. Yes, the parallel did not apply to women that were also trying to look after their families. And there's one case that I think I talk about it at a couple of different points, but one of the women that died she had a daughter that she was looking after. Very sad.
Yes, well, without spoiling too much of the book, I did want to ask you a couple of questions about your interest in true crime. I think everyone who's got that kind of morbid bug where they're interested in true crime they remember the case that kind of started that interest. Do you remember what yours was?
Oh, gosh. Do you know what? I actually think it was probably Sharon Phillips. We talked a little bit about it before, and Sharon's body's never been found. But Sharon I grew up in Brisbane, and Sharon disappeared when I was a teenager. She worked in our local fruit shop, Peaches and Cream.
Wow, okay.
And she was on Ipswich Road heading home one night, and within the space of a very short period of time, in the era before mobile phones, her car broke down. She walked to a nearby public phone booth, called her boyfriend, I think, to say, can come and pick me up. And in the space of time, and I think it was half an hour or some crazy amount of time, he arrived and she was gone. And that then became something that Brisbane, I think it's still, I think even last year, it was in the news media again. I actually think if I really thought about it, that's probably what it was. And it's been there all that time.
And it seems a bit morbid to call a case your favourite, so to speak, but is there a case worldwide that springs to mind as the case that you're fascinated with the most?
Look, I was obsessed with the Stephen Avery case, I think, like a lot of people were, and I continue to follow it. The true crime aspect of it, fascinated by that, but I think also because of my background in sociology, the level of, I should say the Brendan Dassey and Stephen Avery, those two cases being related because his nephew was also implicated and
that was the Making a Murderer one?
Yes, Making a Murderer. And young Brendan Dassey is still in prison for being involved in that crime. It's alleged. So he was put away for it. But because of my background in sociology, and we do a lot, my background's qualitative, interviewing, it is very, very easy to corrupt that process of interviewing someone.
Absolutely.
To get a young person who's vulnerable, who is intimidated, to say whatever they need to say to get themselves out of that situation. And I think if there's a favourite, it would probably be that, in the sense that on multiple levels, it's maddening, as to use your word, and it's fascinating as well, and wrong, terribly wrong.
Yeah, if you want to get an idea of how police can sway an investigation, I think Making a Murderer is probably the best way to look.
Yeah. Kids do say yes when they mean no.
Yeah. Kids
do say yes just to get out of a room because someone's heavying them. They absolutely do those things.
And if it's not too forward to ask what your next book might be about, are you able to give us a little sneak preview?
Yeah, absolutely. Because my focus is social history, as much as we call it true crime, they're very social history-driven books. Yeah. So my next one is on the poisoning cases of the late 40s and the 50s. So again, there's a gender story. Yeah. So the thallium cases that have been written about quite a bit, and I often try to pick something that hasn't been written on before. That's what I like to do. And these ones have been written on, the thallium poisoning cases. There is a little bit around, but I hope I'm approaching it in a slightly different way. So it'll be the 40s, 50s.
That's another one I haven't heard of, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
And that wouldn't happen to be related to the Somerton man case at all?
No, I was
I know
listening to...
he was alleged to be poisoned, but they couldn't find any in his system or something like that.
But
so I'm wondering if...
I know it wasn't, but it was plagued with the same challenges. We talked a little bit about it before, didn't we, about the fact that the level of science... it was a different set of tools that the police had available to them. But isn't that a fascinating case, the Somerton one?
Well, I look forward to reading it. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tanya.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.